Hello, thanks for joining us here in Brussels. I'm standing outside the European Commission building here. Not a lot going on. It is the weekend after all. This is the first day of a new month. It is the start of a new era, though, in terms of Britain's relations with the European Union. No longer will British officials be marching into buildings like this to have their say over day-to-day business or future policy of the European Union. In terms of recognising that moment, I think it's fair to say that Brussels has done very little significant, very few ceremonial moments to speak of. We can show you, however, one or two which are highly symbolic. And let's just start with the lowering of the Union flag. Every member state has its flag flying as a member of this club of 28. Well, it's 27 now, and as the Union flag disappears, the EU's own flag goes up in its place. That is folded and put away, possibly for another day, possibly never to be seen again. It's likely to end up in a museum, we're told, in fact. Added to that, the British government also has to make one or two changes. They have an office which is known locally here as UKREP. It's the UK's representative to the European Union. Well, they don't have that position anymore. So the plaque has been removed, and in its place a new plaque. It's called UKMIS, which stands for the UK's mission to the European Union. And the mission now, of course, is to rebuild, is to create a new arrangement, a new understanding between these two blocks as to how they can work together in the future and how they can maintain, as far as possible, the sort of valuable relations and business that serve both of them. Massive challenge. As I say, that job kicks into play on Monday to a large extent. The EU, the Commission, can lay out its sort of strategy for doing that. Other than that, pretty quiet here. Very different, though, in the UK, in particular in London, but across the country. People were getting out, staying up, seeing how this dawning of a new era just might look, as John Maguire found out.
They had come to Parliament Square from far and wide, from the north,
from Teesside,
and from the south.
I've come from Brighton.
To witness what the rally's star attraction called the greatest moment in modern British history.
We should celebrate the fact that, freed from the constraints of the European Union, we once again will be able to find our place in the world.
To be independent, to be free to make our own trade rules, our own laws, our own trade laws, who we trade with, is supremely important for me as a Briton.
Did you ever doubt that tonight might happen?
Oh yes, you bet.
Right.
We said that at times in those dark days that it would be a miracle if we got Brexit, and I think it is some sort of miracle that we have got Brexit.
So you've come all the way down from Teesside to London, especially for tonight?
Yes.
Tell me why.
Because it's a momentous time in history, really, for the country. And it's worth celebrating, and I wanted to be part of that.
Big Ben's Brexit bongs hadn't materialised. Instead, clocks, both digital and famously analogue, were projected onto 10 Downing Street. While outside the Palace of Westminster, they partied like it was 2020. Well, that is it, Brexit. The giant screens declare in red, white and blue, we're out. 11 o'clock on the 31st of January 2020. One, of course, for the history books, but really it's the future that will determine whether or not this was the right call. Of course, not everyone celebrated. Some commiserated. This was Oxford.
Are we proud to be Europeans?
My business was put at risk because of this, and my kids' futures and jobs are being put at risk by it, and I just profoundly disagree with it. I think it's very against the peace we've had, against the prosperity and the cooperation we've had, and I think we're being very aggressive and arrogant, and I think that's really dangerous for us as a country.
I hope there'll be the wisdom to negotiate something useful and sensible. I really hope so, but I think it's really unknown. I'm not that hopeful at the moment.
In Edinburgh, capital of a country that had voted to remain in the EU, they used music to soothe their souls at Holyrood. and some called for independence to pave the way for a return.
The fact of the matter is that the only way back into the European Union for Scotland is if we regain our statehood and regain our independence.
I'm feeling sad because Brexit's happening, but really optimistic at the fact that Scotland actually has a chance to rejoin the EU and just have a nicer future than Brexit Britain.
But Celtic cousins in Wales, where Leave had the upper hand, lowered the European flag outside the Senedd for the final time.
What really won during this whole thing wasn't just a political, party, it was democracy. Democracy has won, and that's what I'm celebrating.
And on the Irish border, for so long the issue that seemed insurmountable in the pursuit of Brexit, Remainers expressed concern and regret.
Tomorrow morning might not be different, but in the coming weeks and months ahead, as we see rights and opportunities taken away from us, we'll certainly feel it then.
Leave supporters in Parliament Square were told we would still be friends with the people of Europe despite leaving the Union. Meanwhile, a conciliatory message was emblazoned across the white cliffs of Dover, the face we still show to continental Europe, even if, from now on, so much of our relationship has changed. John Maguire, BBC News.
Well, of course, you can stay friends, but under what terms? And that is what is worrying so many businesses and industries right across the European Union and in the UK as well, of course. I want to reflect on that for a moment now, because I'm joined by Jan van der Putten, who is the Secretary General of EFCA, which is the European Federation of Engineering Consultancy. Jan, thanks very much for joining us. We hear a lot already of the need for a level playing field so that everything sort of can carry on as before. How anxious are your members in construction, in engineering? Because these are huge industries.
Well, the UK is claiming that all legislation is aligned to the EU, so negotiations should be straightforward. But at the time being, we don't know where we're heading to. Negotiations still need to start. They should be finalized by the end of June concerning goods and services. But for the time being, we're in limbo, so we don't know whether that will stay aligned. And if that is not the case, what are we heading to?
And you mentioned June as the deadline for goods and services. That's almost like tomorrow, isn't it? It's hardly any time at all.
It is. So we are very anxious and we are insecure about what's going to happen. Nonetheless, we will stay supportive of the British industry, our colleagues over there, and we will try to work on as nothing ever happened.
But what impact does that uncertainty have on engineering consultancies, on constructors across Europe, in terms of the way in which they look at potential business in the UK, maybe?
Well, political stalemate is always bad news for the economy. We don't know what the investments will be and how future tax rules will come up and so on and so forth. So there are more questions than answers.
It's a very regulated industry as well, of course, so these things aren't just nice to have, they're critically important. We're moving into a new era as well, aren't we, in terms of what they call the Green Deal here in the EU. You've got a lot of other things to bother about in any case.
Well, yes, that political stalemate also hampered the regular agendas, like, for example, the circular economy, innovative procurement, the Green Deal, so digitization of the construction industry, you name it. There are so many issues. So we hope that we can continue working as before, but we don't know for the moment.
Yeah, it's another era of uncertainty. Yeah, and we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, though, for just getting an insight into what industry and business once again has to worry about. Let's just focus for a moment on the Brexit deal as such. You will probably recall over the course of the last 3 years that the situation with Ireland, with the border between Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and the Irish Republic, has been critically important, very contentious. Well, Emma Vardy was on the border at the moment of departure.
Well, all of a sudden this invisible geographical line takes on a great new significance. This, where I'm standing, is now the new land border between the UK and the EU. There was no great fanfare, no singing. A small band of protesters gathered here to mark the moment. To the eye, of course, nothing will change, but it will have implications for thousands of businesses across the island. Now, keeping this border open was always such a difficult part of those Brexit negotiations. In the end, a resolution was found through a controversial compromise, which effectively moves this border to the Irish Sea. It leaves Northern Ireland in a bit of a halfway house in future, abiding by EU single market rules, but staying part of the new UK's global trading arrangements. And of course, don't forget, it was always so important to people to keep this border open, because having an open Irish border has been a fundamental part of the peace process in Northern Ireland. After decades of conflict, it has been achieved, but people are still far from happy. A majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain. They're still upset they're being taken out of the EU against their will, whereas others are angry that Northern Ireland is going to have to remain in different arrangements to the rest of the UK. But after all those rows, those battles over British and Irish identity, really now negotiations over the next 11 months will determine exactly how it's all going to work in practice.
Yeah, Emma Vardy reflecting some of the uncertainties and insecurities in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. They're not the only ones with worries. Let's just throw our light onto Gibraltar for a moment, a British overseas territory on the south coast of Spain. Of course, it's been British since the 17th century, but Spain claims it as its own territory. What is going to happen to them? It's an issue which Gavin Lee has been looking at. He's been speaking to Gibraltar's First Minister, Fabian Picardo.
Yesterday was laced with an element of sadness for us. I mean, the EU has been an important part of the political life of Gibraltar, not just for 47 years, but in particular since Spain joined in 1986 and the gates were kicked open as a result a couple of years earlier. So I think there was an element of trepidation when we voted 3 years ago, and we lost that vote. And yesterday we had to give effect to the result of the winner's view, which was that we should leave and lower the European flag.
And it is worth saying that this was the area where most people voted to remain. 96% of 32,000 people, well, those who voted to remain. And you've been caught in the slipstream, I guess, by all of this. But one thing that's worth pointing out is we've been talking about this border. You have mentioned in a previous interview that what about the idea of staying in the Schengen passport-free zone, like Switzerland that's not in the EU, Liechtenstein, for example? Tell me more about that.
Well, we didn't say staying in because we're not presently in, but we said let's do an arrangement with the Schengen zone, which might mean joining, although that might be a little over-ambitious, so it may mean having like the equivalent of a travel area agreement with the Schengen zone, so that we don't move into the stage where we have immigration controls, which are stricter than we can really suffer here, because you've got 15,000 people crossing this frontier principally to come to work in Gibraltar between 8 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning, and you just can't put controls in the way of them and get them to work on time. And of course, you've also got a resident population in Gibraltar, and you've got people across the way who have families in Gibraltar, and requiring them to have visas or to have their passport stamped if they want to go and see their relatives or simply want to pop over to the European Union for lunch would be really quite impossible to police in an appropriate way.
Fabian Picardo there.